Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Tomcat Stitchery. I'm Whitney and I have another bonus video for you today, another tutorial. Today we are tackling shirt tail hems. I find my favorite way to do a shirt tail hem is using some either pre-made or you made. It's very easy to make yourself. And actually I'm going to pop a link up to my making bias tape from men's thrifted silk ties. This is a great use for that application. I also have a hair in my eye. I'm having some real issues with hair falling into my eyes. But that's a great use. You could definitely use men's silk ties, thrifted, to make your own bias tape to use for this application. So basically we're using bias tape to finish off shirt tail hems with kind of a facing. But number one, it makes sewing those curves in a shirt tail hem very easy, much easier than trying to fold and fold, because there's just so many convex and concave curves as you go around a shirt tail hem. And it also adds a fun little pop of color on the inside of your shirt that people might get a peek of when you're moving, just, you know, seeing the back of the shirt if you have it untucked. But it's just a fun way to customize your clothes. So I hope you enjoy this. Leave me a comment below if you have any questions at all, and I will see you guys on Friday. Bye!
Okay guys, time for another tutorial. I have here in front of me my almost completed Sedona shirt, my designer stitched Sedona shirt, which is one of this month's Sew My Style patterns. And I just wanted to show you an alternative way to finish. Literally the shirt's completely done, except for the hem. And I want to show you a way that you can finish the hem because shirt tail hems can be really difficult. And in saying that, okay, here's the hem of my shirt. So shirt tail hems have a lot of curve usually to them. This one, you know, definitely a big curve, comes up to, you know, the high point at the side seam, and then it'll come back down for the bottom and goes back up to the side seam again, which is a shirt tail hem. But a lot of times that can get really difficult when you're trying to fold under and then fold under again, because depending on if you're doing a outer curve or an inner curve, I can never remember which one's convex and which one's concave. So if you're, you know, trying to tuck under an outer curve or an inner curve, you either have too much fabric that you're folding in or not enough. So a way that I found that number one, I think makes it easier to sew a hem. Oh my gosh, my fingernails look horrible. Sorry about that. Another way that, again, makes it much easier to sew the hem and keeps it flat, but it's also a fun little added detail to do, and that is a bias hem facing. So you're using bias tape to do a bias tape facing basically on the hem. Now I have chosen this cotton to use for my hem. And that is because on this shirt I had some leftover from another, this is part of a mini capsule, and I have used this contrasting fabric for the inside of my cuffs and also my undercollar, my inner collar stand, and I think that's everything. So I thought it would be fun to use it for the hem. So this is a really fun way, again, number one, just to customize your me-made clothes because that's fun, and also makes it easier to sew. So my recommendation is to use a bias tape that kind of goes with your fabric. Now I would almost always recommend rayon and silk. They just, I mean, they're slipperier, but they do like to hug the curves on this type of application very well. However, cotton totally works too. And I am using, the shirt is made out of a linen and kind of a very bodied linen. So maybe a medium weight linen I would describe this fabric as. So using a cotton is absolutely fine. Now if I were sewing this in a really drapey rayon or a silk, I would not necessarily want to use cotton for the bias hem facing, because that's going to just make the hem almost stand out from the body. Which, if you're wanting to do that for the hem of some type of a garment, then by all means, yes. But typically you want to use something that is the same as the fabric that the main garment is made out of. So again, if you're making a cotton shirt, cotton lawn, that kind of thing, you could either use self fabric. I'm going to put a link to my bias tape tutorial for men's silk ties. That would definitely work on any of these. Yeah, silk, rayon, any of that works really well for this application. So let's talk about the bias tape a little bit. What I've done is I've made my own bias tape, and I have cut strips of bias a little bit over 2 inches wide. So the hem allowance on this top is 5/8 of an inch. So 5/8 of an inch times 2, because we're folding this in half, is 1 1/4 inches, and I want at least 3/8 of an inch to be able to fold up. So 3/8 of an inch times 2, because again, this is folded in half, is 3/4, which comes to 2 inches. 1 1/4 plus 3/4 is 2 inches. I go a little bit over that just to account for the turn of the cloth when you're sewing things up. So I have cut strips of bias tape. I've sewed them all together on the bias. I also like some of these, you can kind of see the stripes are going opposite ways at my joins, just because there's not really a right side to this fabric, so I was literally just kind of flying, but I kind of like that. I think that's fun. So all you're going to do is make a long, continuous, little over 2 inch wide strip of bias tape, and you're just going to fold it in half and press it. And that is all you need. And so now I'm going to show you, we're just going to stitch it at 5/8 of an inch, trim, understitch, fold it up, top stitch, and we'll be done. So I'm going to move you to the tripod so you can see me doing this on the sewing machine.
All right, so I have my bias tape here, and I've got raw edge on this side and the folded edges on this side. So I like to sew with my bias tape on the feed dogs because it's going to help make it sew around to the curve. It helps ease that in. You always want to sew with your piece that is less stable or more on the bias on the feed dogs because they will help you sew. All right, so I've got this down. Again, my folded edge is to the left, well, to my left. You're facing me, so it's your right. But if you're sitting at the sewing machine, it would be away from the sewing machine. And the raw edge is towards the sewing machine because you're sewing the raw edges of the bias binding to the raw edge of the blouse. And I like to leave about, I don't know, an inch maybe of excess at the end just for some insurance, basically. So I'm sewing right side of the blouse to, I guess the right side of the tape. And I'm going to sew at 5/8 of an inch because that is the hem allowance for this top. And I'm basically sewing around. It's really easy where it's flat. But then you come to the curve. Ooh, and I'm actually gonna sit with this bias tape roll in my lap. And so then it's just a matter of gently just making sure that bias tape is lining up to the edge of your shirt. And just go slow. You'll probably only be able to make sure an inch or so at a time is lined up with the cut edge, especially when you get into the steeper curves. And when you're going around the outer curves, again, I can never remember if that's convex or concave. Sorry, let me move my light out of the way. Gently kind of, almost not really pushing the bias tape through, but kind of gently ease it in a little bit more because you'll need a little bit more. And then when you get to the parts where it's an inner curve, kind of stretch it just a little bit. Not a lot, just a little bit. And again, when you get to these side seams, it's a very steep curve, so just go slow. All right, so what we have here is, if you can see, we've got the stitching line that's right there, and we've got maybe a little over 3/8 of an inch, because remember, I made these just a little bit wider than 2 inches. So we have about 3/8 of an inch that's there. So now, what we're gonna wanna do is this seam allowance that we've just stitched, I wanna trim this to like 1/4 of an inch, maybe even just shy of 1/4 of an inch, all the way around, and then we are going to understitch. So let me trim and I'll come right back. Okay, once you have trimmed it all down, I don't know if you can see that stitching line. I have a little less than 1/4 of an inch. We're going to flip, sorry, my chair is rolling away with me here. I'm leaning forward and pushing my chair away. All right, we're gonna flip this. So here's the right side of my shirt and here's my hem facing. We're gonna flip this, and the reason we cut that seam allowance so short is that we don't want it to extend past that bias tape facing, but we are going to understitch the seam allowance to the bias binding. So we're gonna sew on the bias binding really close to that seam line and make sure that the seam allowance is toward the bias, not towards the shirt. And again, I'm not pressing anything yet. Make note of that. This is so much easier. Okay, so I'm going to understitch. All right, so once you've understitched, your hem's gonna look like this. You're gonna have the hem and then the bias tape, and again, should have that fold right there. If you have any places where that seam allowance is hanging down further than your bias tape, now is the time to trim that back as much as possible. Now, you can, if you want to, go to the iron and just kind of lightly iron, but because of the understitching, when you flip that under to the wrong side, a little bit of that shirt fabric should be showing on the inside. So I am gonna go to the iron and just give it a good press, and I'm going to press this bias tape, sorry, it's the wrong side of the shirt. I'm gonna press this bias tape up into the shirt. Okay, before I do that, I just thought of something. All right, you should have these tails still on the end. What you're going to do is, you can trim them a little bit. You don't need quite that much tail, but we're going to wrap them around the shirt so that when that gets folded up and sewn, it'll look like that. Focus, camera. Focus. Okay? It'll be a nice clean edge. So again, this is the wrong side. You've got your bias tape sticking up above your seam allowance. You're gonna wrap that tail, and again, you don't need this much, but, and I'll trim this a little bit, but you're gonna wrap that and then fold that to the wrong side and get all that nice and pressed. Still, you don't really need any pins if you don't want to use any, but of course, use pins if you prefer. All right, everything is pressed. So as you can see, there's a little bit of the shirt that peeks up over the edge, and again, I've wrapped and pressed those ends in. So now I'm just gonna top stitch from the front, and you can kind of feel, actually I can see through just a tad where this bias binding is, because my shirt is white linen, but you can sometimes just feel to make sure that you're catching. I mean, if you want to sew from that side, that's fine, but I'm gonna actually top stitch from the right side and make sure that I'm catching the bias tape in the bottom. The other reason I'm doing it this way is that, again, the feed dogs are gonna help ease that bias tape through these sharp curves. Even though we've pressed it, it's nice to have the help of the feed dogs. All right, and it's all stitched down. So you can see, let me show you the wrong side of the shirt here. You'll have a stitching line right next to the fold where you've understitched, and then one up closer to the fold at the top to stitch it down. So isn't that lovely? I will give you a closer look here. I'm gonna go hit it with the iron one last time, and then I'll give you a closer look.
Okay, I just wanted to show you, sorry, a little closer up of what we're dealing with here. So here is the front of the shirt. It's peeking out just a little bit, but I need to go back and unpick that second line of stitching I did because this has got the hidden button placket and it's got a lot of layers right there and just got a little thick. But yeah, here's my line, excuse the fingernails, line of stitching on the outside, and then on the inside, you have the understitching there, and then you've got your top stitching here. Yeah, and it just finishes off the hem so nicely, and it just goes around the curves so well. These deep curves and into this top curve. And this one is especially a hard curve. But anyway, it's just a fun way to customize your me-made clothing and also make sewing a shirt tail hem much easier. So I hope you enjoyed that tutorial, and happy shirt making.